Note taking was something that I did quite a lot throughout my academic journey. Near the start of GCSEs especially, I'd taken quite a few notes both inside and outside of lessons. However, near the end of GCSE, I kind of scrapped note taking as a form of revision altogether, and throughout A levels that definitely carried through. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Jack here and I'm a student studying in London, and in this video I'm going to talk about my experience with not taking any notes throughout A levels and why I actually decided not to. Note taking is quite a common form of revision, and when you go to A levels you'll definitely see people carrying folders and folders full of notes, but that wasn't something that really worked for me, and in this video I'm going to go through why. Now, this isn't me telling you not to take any notes whatsoever. If note taking is something you enjoy doing and it's something that you feel works for you, this isn't me invalidating that or telling you that you're wrong. This is just me sharing my experience and you can take from it what you will. Another thing worth noting is when I say I didn't take any notes throughout A levels, that doesn't mean I did not make a single note whatsoever. There were instances where I did make notes, and I'm also going to talk about those instances in this video and go into why I decided to take notes in those specific cases. But all you need to know is for the most part I didn't take any notes and I don't regret it one bit. Just for reference, like I mentioned in many other videos, I did biology, chemistry, maths and psychology. So if you have any specific questions about maybe how I approach those subjects without taking notes, then just ask away in the comments below. Now, reason number one for me not taking any notes for A levels is that there was simply too much content to physically take notes on. If you're doing A levels, then you know that there's a significant amount of content, and when you flip through the textbook you'll just see pages and pages, and realistically I knew that if I was to use note taking as a primary form of revision, that I just wouldn't be able to get through the content quick enough. Even throughout GCSEs, when I did used to use note taking as a form of revision, I typically would still be making notes on a chapter we've already gone through in class while the teacher was already moving on to the next chapter. It just wasn't sustainable, and in the long run it just started building up and the workload became unreal. With that experience, I just knew realistically going into A levels that note taking was not a good idea for me. I wouldn't be able to make notes quick enough, and I found that even from my personal experience, I'd sometimes see students scrambling through their notebooks or folders and with all their notes and just trying to keep up with all the content. It just didn't seem like a really effective way to revise for me, at least. Reason number two for not making notes was essentially that anything I would make notes on was already available for me. Everything was already in the textbook. Everything I needed to know, everything I needed to learn was already written out in front of me. So I didn't see the point of just rewriting it. Yes, I could have summarized it. Yes, I could have changed some of the words, but essentially I was just going to end up writing the same thing that's already in the textbook onto another piece of paper and just maybe make it a bit more colorful and add a bit of highlighting. And after doing that for GCSEs, going into A levels, it just didn't seem to make sense to me why I was spending so much time making notes when everything was already there. When thinking about making notes, the only purpose I can really think of is when you want to reread them to kind of brush up on something that you might not have understood. Realistically, if I was going through a certain chapter and I suddenly didn't feel too confident on it, or I just needed one or two things brushed up, I realized that I could literally just open the textbook and read what they'd already written, or maybe do a quick Google search and just fill in that little gap. There's no need for me to make pages and pages of notes to do that when there are already resources in place. At least that's what I felt. Reason number three for me not really making any notes whatsoever at A level was that it was just way too passive for me. Active recall was a concept that I came across near the end of GCSEs, and I can confidently say that it completely changed my perception as a student as well as how I approach my revision. With A levels, the majority of the revision techniques that I would implement kind of all boiled down to having the foundation of active recall. When I think about notes, like I said, the only use I really see with them is to reread them when you want to refresh your mind or something, or you want to memorize something. And in my opinion, just rereading your notes is just not very stimulating, and I found that it would be quite a boring task or revision method to just reread things over and over again. Yes, notes may look pretty, but in my opinion, moving to more active revision methods in A-level, for example, using Anki flashcards, not only were more useful, but it definitely felt a lot more rewarding. With notes, I personally feel like you can't really question yourself, so there's no real action and reward involved. Whereas with flashcards or active recall, you kind of have like a reward. It's like you're doing a question and you get it right, and you just get that nice feeling of finally understanding content, especially when there's a certain card that you may have like just kept getting wrong over and over again, and then you eventually test yourself on it and you get it right. It's a really satisfying feeling that I personally don't think you can really get with making loads and loads of notes and just rereading them. I also feel like notes aren't really that useful when it comes to revising, because the whole point of making notes is, I assume, so that when you're revising you can use them later on, especially closer to the exam. However, I feel like one issue with notes is that a lot of people will make them and then they'll fall behind and they'll have to catch up, and then they'll just say that they'll eventually come around to using them, but they never really do until right next to exam season when they're frantically rereading their notes. However, I found with things like flashcards, it's like as you make them you can immediately start using them, because they're a lot quicker to make and they're also a lot quicker to go through than reading pages and pages of notes. For this reason, flashcards and active recall just seemed like a more useful thing to invest my time into, because it meant that not only closer to the exam season, but also just in general throughout the year, I could always be going through them and I could always be strengthening my knowledge on my A-level topics, which is something that I don't feel I could have done if I'd invested most of my time in making pretty notes, for example. Reason number 4 is that I feel like there are certain subjects that just don't accommodate to note taking, whereas with active recall methods like flashcards and doing practice questions, this can really apply to any subject. Now, like I said, this isn't me telling you not to take any notes, but there are definitely some subjects that I feel I can say with confidence that note taking just doesn't make sense. For example, with maths, I just don't understand how it could be useful to make pages and pages of notes for maths. Now, there are definitely certain subjects I did where I could somewhat understand why people were making notes. For example, with psychology, biology, chemistry, they're more content heavy, so maybe I can somewhat understand. But with subjects like maths, it just didn't really make sense why anyone would want to make notes. With subjects like maths, I just found that simply paying attention in class and doing all the questions that your teachers give you and kind of applying that content to the question, which is a more active form of learning, you'd be more likely to retain all the information. Whereas with note taking, it just doesn't make sense, especially with such a practical subject like maths, where a lot of the learning happens through doing questions. Another reason I just don't like notes is because it's sometimes very hard to find a balance. I found personally that sometimes even just doing nothing and simply listening to what the teacher says can sometimes be more useful than frantically trying to copy down everything the teacher says, trying to get all the information down into your books or your notepads, and just risking like missing the explanation. I just feel like a lot of people, when they make notes, kind of shoot themselves in the legs and they give themselves more work to do outside of lesson, because come the end of the lesson, sure, they've got all these notes in their textbook, but because they haven't really had time to balance between taking the notes and listening to the teacher, the notes kind of don't make any sense to them and they haven't really understood the content. They've just got a bunch of mindless notes, which is something that I just felt was a waste of time. Now, like I mentioned at the start, there were moments where I did take notes. Now, this might seem a bit contradictory considering I've just spent the last few minutes talking about why I didn't take notes and why I thought taking notes wasn't really a good thing. But there were some instances where I did take notes, and I'm just going to talk about those instances. Now, the first instance was definitely near the start of year 12 in class. It's sometimes hard to explain to teachers that you don't like taking notes, and sometimes when you're in class, not taking notes can be seen as you not paying attention. So sometimes I'd simply take notes just so I wouldn't get on the teacher's bad side and just so that it didn't look like I was slacking off. However, eventually I did talk to a lot of my teachers, and a lot of them were really understanding and let me do most of my note taking on my laptop, where I'd just end up making flashcards that I'd later import into Anki. However, sometimes I did feel like taking notes was useful in instances where a teacher might go through something and they might add a bit of insight that's not in the textbook or you can't really find online, that I thought would be really useful to potentially implement into a flashcard later on, so I just quickly note it down. So I think the key thing there is that I wouldn't note down everything, but mainly if the teacher added something onto what was already on the PowerPoint, then I'd consider writing it down. Because especially if the teachers put it on the PowerPoint, I found that just simply asking them to send me the PowerPoint either during lesson or after was more convenient than me copying down everything. The second instance where I would take notes, I'd say, is when I was trying to understand content. Now this is something that I've mentioned in my video where I talk about how to understand content, but I talk about how, for me personally, one really good way I find that lets me understand content is once I come home to just watch a quick YouTube video, maybe summarizing whatever I've gone through in class. Typically these videos are no longer than 5 to 10 minutes, and a lot of the time I would speed them up just to save time, but I found that watching these videos was a really good way to fill in any gaps I might have had during lesson. But the issue was that sometimes when I'd watch the videos, obviously watching a video is quite a passive task, and mainly why it wouldn't be my sole revision technique, but I'd sometimes lose focus while watching a video. And what this meant was that I'd be watching a video and then maybe 1 minute in I'd suddenly realize that I hadn't actually taken anything in, so I'd have to rewind back and rewatch it again, and it would just waste time. So sometimes what I'd do is I'd just bring out my iPad or a piece of paper and I'd just take very brief notes as I was watching the video, not because I was planning to use them for the future, but just so that it made sure that I was paying attention to the video and that I wasn't wandering elsewhere or trying to focus on something else. It was kind of like forcing me to focus on the video, because the moment I'd stop taking notes I'd realize that my focus has wandered off, but while taking the notes it would force me to actively listen to the video. Now I didn't really use these notes, mainly why I did it on my iPad to not waste paper, and it meant that I could just delete it afterwards rather than throwing it away. But it was just that small instance where I took notes. I wouldn't say that it really made a big difference in my grade, but it is just an instance where I did do note taking and I feel it's worth mentioning. And with that, we have reached the end of the video. So if you found the video interesting or you found it useful, then leave a like, subscribe, and let me know what you thought in the comments below. That was just a few reasons why I decided not to take notes. There might have been something I missed, or there might be something you're curious about, so if there is any questions, just ask straight away in the comments and I'll get back to you. Now, like I mentioned at the start, this was just my experience. This isn't me saying that if you decide to take notes, or if you're someone who prefers to take notes, that you can't do well in your A-levels, but just for me personally, note taking wasn't the way to go. And just for reference, I got 5 A stars for my A-levels, and I definitely say that scrapping note taking and prioritizing more active forms of revision played a very big role in that success. Thank you so much if you've made it this far. That's been all from me, and goodbye.